Australian context and the South Australian context. We've had a close look at the Maori models, and there's some useful things there, but I think one of the dangers is that Maori have treaties. There's difference in cultural understandings, and you can't just lift one model from another space into the Australian context. I think the Australian settings have to develop their own forms that actually recognise that for a lot of Indigenous people the risks are potentially more because there aren't treaties. Native title may not have been resolved. Native title might be a problem for people. So this process we've been developing, Ngarrindjeri been developing, is specifically targeted towards assessing the risks, in a sense, of cultural well-being for the Ngarrindjeri from a Ngarrindjeri perspective in this context, in this legal, legislative planning setting. So I think there's good things to be learnt from the international examples, and when you compare South Australia to what goes on around the rest of the world, that's really important because you can see where there's big gaps in what we should be doing.
About anybody else on the panel? Anybody else want to add to that? Any other questions? Yep.
Sorry if you already dealt with this because I came in part way through, but the ground truthing, could you explain a bit more about that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a non-scientist, so I came across ground truthing through working in the CLIM project. There are other scientists who can probably, in this group, could explain it. I can do a critique of it from a cultural studies perspective or an Indigenous perspective, but does somebody want to explain it quickly? Go on. Yeah.
Hello. Well, I don't know if I can do it justice, but I think ground truthing, my understanding is you've got your, it's almost like calibrating, is that right? So you've got your satellites that are telling you what's where, and what you're doing is you're on the ground and you've got your little, I think it's called a trimble or something, is that what it's called? And you walk around, and so you basically line up where you are with what the satellite is telling you. So you just sort of ground truth it, so you make sure that it's calibrated.
Yep. And you identify what you're seeing, so you make sure that this is the right species, or this is you're actually adding to the map that's been created. So I guess from the Indigenous perspective, engaging in ground truthing, there's also the opportunity to think about what are some of the truths that Indigenous perspectives can be added to that map that's being developed. So.
I have a question for Melissa. I'm just wondering whether the Ngarrindjeri people could use your excellent data storage project, or is it being used in other Indigenous groups?
Yeah, it was first developed up in the APY lands, and it's now being utilised by, I think, quite a few different groups across South Australia, I think also Western Australia. It's really up to the individual groups if that's something they want to go down and is something that they require for their group. So, yeah, it would really be up to the Ngarrindjeri they might already have their own database or their own type of system where they look after their knowledge. So, yeah, it's on a group-by-group basis, really. Yeah.
Thanks. Kind of continuing on there, Steve mentioned the sort of the cultural knowledge, that there are aspects that can't be shared amongst different people. How does that get managed within that archive database, where they're within the community who have access to it? Like, I understand that it's not a publicly accessible archive, but how are the sensitivities within that community shared, and so how can knowledge be annotated?
That's a really good question. I didn't have time to go into it because the database is quite amazing, all the archiving way it does, but there is restrictions. So in the APY example, they've got 3 databases. They didn't even feel it was appropriate for men and women to have the information in the same database. They've got one which is a community-style database, and they've got a men's database and then a women's database. But if you were like our community that we're working with is quite small at this stage, and they don't really have that restriction between men and women, they're quite happy to have both information in the database, but then there's sensitivity restrictions, so you can restrict either an individual piece of knowledge or a piece of media, and only a certain person or a certain family can see that piece of media. So it's quite amazing in how you can build that into the... And there's also things around if someone dies, there's a sorrow, so you can go in and just say, for this amount of time, we don't want any media about that person to be accessible, so that person kind of gets taken off the database for a certain amount of time until the community feels like they're wanting to put that information back on again. So that has, it has been quite looked into, and everyone seems quite happy with. And because these are live, like on the web, so if someone out in community sees a photo and go, actually, that shouldn't be there, they can restrict it straight away. Then that gets sent to Adelaide to the database people, and then they'll contact that person to make sure that that piece of image, and if there's anything else relating to that image, that should also be restricted. So it puts the power back into the community as well to restrict information as they need to.
Yeah, I was just wondering, we often talk about managing assets across jurisdictions. Is any of the programs that you mentioned, Steve, do the Ngarrindjeri people get a chance to work with other tribes that are represented or people up the river? Like, for example, from the top of the New South Wales-Victorian border, the management of the Darling there and how that infiltrates down into South Australia. Do they work together with their cultures?
Grant Rigney, who is one of the co-authors on these papers, was also chair of Mildren, which is the Murray Lower Darlings Indigenous Nations group. Daryl and Grant's dad, Uncle Matt Rigney, was one of the first chairs of that organisation. So there's been a lot of collaboration over a lot of years between the nations along the river, and there are multiple opportunities to work together. The Ngarrindjeri also have a project formally with the Gunditjmara people in Western Victoria. So work with the Kimberleys, the Torres Strait and some other spaces. So there are ongoing opportunities to work together with other nations around the country. And the River Murray, the Murray-Darling Basin, certainly has had a number of different collaborations put together between nations to actually work together as an organised sort of group of people to try to actually advocate for the health of the overall Murray and Darling. So yeah, but not as much as people would like to, I suppose, but it's happening. Yeah.
I reckon we've got time for one more question. And there was someone over here who had their hand up a while ago.
Yeah, I was just noting the Premier's sort of statement about committing to the letters patent statement. So what sort of work has been happening on a state level? Is that being followed up with some work?
Well, I think the state government would argue that the change to the South Australian Constitution was part of that, recognising Indigenous people in the South Australian Constitution. This move to regional authorities policy, which is also recognising those sort of commitments. Don Dunstan was the first Premier to raise the letters patent, since the very early days, and originally the Aboriginal Lands Trust was set up as a kind of in recognition of the commitment of the letters patent. So Indigenous leaders, though, and elders and others are doing, still working on other kinds of strategies and issues. People still want to a lot of people want a treaty, want to actually negotiate some different arrangement. So lots happening, yeah.
I reckon we could squeeze one more question in. There was one fellow over there.
Thank you. I guess my question is perhaps directed to you, Steve, but the presentation that we've had with regards to the Working on Country project was a different way of tackling what you might call barriers that exist in trying to get your aims and your outcomes, whether it be the NRA or whatever. Do you see merit in that approach for the NRA rather than just having to have that continual headbang with, say, government by and large to get recognition, to get money?
I think, two things. I think firstly, the Ngarrindjeri approach isn't that. Because what we've done is we've worked collaboratively with the government for the last 5 years on these projects. So to start with, exactly what we've been doing is actually working collaboratively with local councils, NRM boards, DUNA, specifically on multiple projects across the region. And just the KMY Task Force, for instance, is a monthly meeting which brings together people to talk about issues in complex ways from government departments, Ngarrindjeri community. There's been, what, how many is there now?
Yeah, over
70 something of those meetings that go for 3, 4, 5 hours, which give opportunities for people to talk to each other, to learn from each other. They're very much educational kind of processes. So we definitely, support the approach that the Working on Country program sort of used. We did a similar assessment of the Riverine Recovery Project, looking at used the same model for doing an assessment of success. So I think what Ngarrindjeri did is exactly what you're saying, is that post-High Marsh Island, leaders said, we can't rely on legislation to protect us. Trying to fight in the media is not going to work. We have to work out another way of doing it. Not taking a soft position on things still having a very clear position on where the line is, but working collaboratively and trying to work together. So I think it's the only way to succeed at the end of the day, from my perspective. But you've got to be strong on where you stand, but you've got to be willing to negotiate and collaborate and work together. Yep.
All right, I think it's lunchtime. So just want to thank all the presenters again. Put your hands together for them. See you later.